What if the most powerful medicine in the world doesn't come in a bottle? What if it's not something you swallow, but something you awaken? What if healing was never missing, but only forgotten? There was once a man who had it all: wealth, a high-powered job, admiration from peers. But behind the expensive suits and the polished smiles was a soul quietly drowning. Sleepless nights, anxiety pills, a heart that raced for no reason. He had everything except peace. Until one morning, out of sheer exhaustion, he sat down. No phone, no schedule, no fixing, just silence. And in that silence, something shifted. He noticed his breath. He heard birds he hadn't heard in years. He cried, not from pain, but from remembering what it meant to simply be. That man could have been anyone. It could be the CEO, the mother of 3, the burned-out student, or you. This is not a story about medicine. It's a story about remembering. Remembering that healing isn't something we must chase. It's something we allow. And for over 2,500 years, Buddhist wisdom has quietly offered this truth: that the body knows how to heal, that the mind can be still, and that within silence, there is power. Today, we invite you on a journey, not into theory, but into experience. We'll explore 10 Zen secrets for natural healing. No medication, no pressure, no force, just breathe, awareness, stillness, compassion. Each of these secrets is like a seed, and when planted into your daily life, they don't just reduce stress, they transform the way you live, love, and exist. So take a deep breath, slow down, let go of everything you thought healing had to be, and open yourself to the silent revolution of healing. Let's begin. With the most powerful doorway into your healing, your breath. The breath, so ordinary, we often forget it's even there. But in the world of Zen, breath is sacred. It is the bridge, the invisible thread connecting body and mind, moment and eternity, suffering and peace. Many years ago, there was a soldier haunted by the memories of war. He returned home, but his battles never ended. Each night, his heart raced as if still dodging bullets. His body was safe, but his mind was trapped in chaos. No pill could quiet it. No therapy could reach it. Until one day, an old monk simply told him, "Sit, close your eyes, and breathe," not to escape the past, but to come home to the now. At first, it felt pointless. His mind rebelled. But then, a moment came. Just one breath felt real. That single moment of being fully alive was the beginning of everything. Pause, slow, and emotional. You see, breath is not just air. It is awareness in motion. It is life expressing itself in waves, rising, falling, here, now. In the Anapanasati Sutta, the Buddha taught a simple but profound path: to be mindful of breathing in and breathing out. Not to control the breath, but to feel it, to return to it, to trust it. Because when your breath is calm, your mind softens. When your breath is deep, your thoughts grow still. And when you fully inhabit your breath, you are no longer lost in the past, nor anxious for the future. You are free. Modern science is finally catching up. Doctors now speak of the vagus nerve, of heart rate variability, of how conscious breathing heals the nervous system, boosts immunity, reduces inflammation. But Zen has known all along that the breath is more than biology. It is the anchor of presence. It is the quiet healer, available every moment. So next time you're overwhelmed, before reaching for your phone, before numbing out or pushing through, stop, just stop, and take one breath, not to fix anything, but to feel everything. Because sometimes healing begins not when we add more, but when we finally pause and let the breath bring us back to life. Let's continue. Now that we've remembered the breath, let's explore the second Zen secret of healing, the art of letting go. We've remembered the breath, that sacred anchor in the storm. But what happens when the storm isn't outside, but within? Pain, fear, the need to control, the weight of all we're holding on to. In the teachings of Zen, there is no healing without release. And so the next secret is not about adding anything to your life. It's about learning the art of letting go. There's a famous Zen parable. A young man crossed rivers and mountains to meet an old master. Carrying a heavy bag on his back, he said, "Master, I've come to learn how to be free." The master smiled and replied, "Then, put down your bag." The student blinked, confused. "I mean spiritually free," he said. The master's voice was calm. "Then why do you still carry?" So often, we live exactly like that student, carrying old resentments, worries about the future, shame from the past. We carry judgments, expectations, identities we think we must protect. But the truth is, every moment we hold on, we suffer. And every moment we let go, we heal. Music shifts slightly, evoking lightness. Letting go does not mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending you're okay. It means choosing not to carry the pain like a badge of identity. It means whispering to your own heart, "You don't have to hold this anymore." In Buddhist psychology, clinging is the root of dukkha, that subtle dissatisfaction that haunts even the most successful lives. We cling to people who have long left. We cling to ideas of who we're supposed to be. We even cling to healing itself, trying so hard to fix ourselves that we forget to just feel. But Zen invites a different path. Let the leaf fall, let the river flow, let yourself unclench, not because you're giving up, but because you're giving space. True healing often begins with a quiet whisper inside. "This is too heavy. I'm ready to let it go." And when we drop what no longer serves us, even for a moment, there is peace, there is freedom, and in that freedom, the body softens, the heart opens, the mind returns to silence. So take a breath, feel what you're carrying, and ask yourself gently, do I really need to hold this one more day? Now that we've begun to release, let's move deeper into the healing journey by touching the very roots of our suffering, pain. In the next chapter, we explore the most misunderstood force of all, and how, in Zen, pain can become the doorway to awakening. Pain, the one thing we all try to escape, the ache in the heart, the tightness in the chest, the unspoken grief. But what if I told you that pain is not the enemy, that your deepest wounds might be the very doorway to awakening? There was once a Zen monk named Hakuin. In his youth, he was fierce and determined, driven by a desire to reach enlightenment. One day, while meditating in solitude, he was struck with a violent illness. His body writhed in agony. He could barely move. The pain shattered all his pride, and in the depth of that suffering, he gave up. Not out of defeat, but out of surrender. He let go of seeking, let go of becoming. He simply felt the pain without resistance. And in that moment, he broke through, not into more pain, but into vast peace. In Buddhism, we don't run from pain. We turn toward it. We sit with it, breathe into it, listen to it. Because pain, when met with presence, ceases to be suffering and becomes a teacher. The Buddha himself did not awaken by avoiding discomfort. He awakened by sitting beneath the Bodhi tree, facing every shadow of mind, every temptation, every fear, until only clarity remained. You see, suffering is not the problem. Our resistance to it is. We say, "I shouldn't feel this. This shouldn't be happening. I must get rid of this pain before I can be whole." But Zen whispers something radical. What if you are already whole, even in your pain? What if this heartbreak, this diagnosis, this moment of collapse is not a punishment, but an invitation? Modern psychology now echoes this truth. Trauma that is met with safety and awareness can transform. Neurons rewire, hearts reopen, new life emerges from what we thought would destroy us. The lotus grows in the mud, not despite it, but because of it. So too does awakening bloom from your darkest moments. And when you stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and begin asking, "What is this trying to awaken in me?" everything shifts. Sit with your pain, not to drown in it, not to fix it, but to befriend it. Because pain, when held in presence, becomes wisdom, and that wisdom heals. Let us continue. Now that we have seen how pain can awaken the heart, we turn to another hidden source of healing, one that requires no medicine, no effort, just silence. In the next chapter, we enter the deep forest of stillness, the healing power of emptiness. After the fire of pain comes the hush of space, the still, ungraspable silence that Zen calls emptiness. But emptiness is not a void. It is not nothingness. It is not despair. It is presence, stripped of noise. It is pure awareness, without clinging, without fear. We spend our lives chasing more thoughts, more noise, more identity. But Zen invites us to step back, to sit, to drop every idea about who we are, until all that remains is just this. There is a teaching in Zen. When the mind is empty, the world becomes clear. Not because we've added clarity, but because we've removed the filters. Have you ever watched a lake at dawn? Still, silent, reflecting the sky without effort? That's the mind in emptiness. In emptiness, healing happens without you trying. The body relaxes. The nervous system unwinds. The old stories stop replaying. You are no longer the one who suffers. You are the space in which suffering arises and passes. The Buddha did not teach emptiness as a philosophy, but as medicine. He knew. The more we identify with our thoughts, the more we suffer. But when we rest in emptiness, we are free, not detached, not numb, but open, like the sky, vast, unshaken. This is why meditation is not about achieving something. It's about remembering what's always been here. You don't create emptiness. You return to it. You let go of all that is not truly you. And suddenly, the mind is still. The heart is soft. The moment is enough. Try this now. Take one breath and drop everything for just 1 second. No past, no future, no story. Just breathe. Just space. That is the healing power of emptiness. Now that we have touched stillness, we must return to the world. But this time, we carry a new energy with us. In the next chapter, we learn how Zen turns everyday presence into a tool for healing and transformation. Let's step into the next secret. Walking with awareness, Zen in motion. Stillness is powerful, but healing doesn't end in stillness. It must flow into our every step, into our every movement. Because healing, true healing, is not a state. It's a way of being. There's a Zen saying, before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. It may sound simple, but it's profound. We think that enlightenment means escaping the world, avoiding the hustle, finding peace in a far-off monastery. But Zen says, the world is your monastery, and every step, every movement can be sacred. When you walk, do you walk with your whole being? Or do you rush? Do you hurry to the next task? Or are you fully present, feeling each footstep meet the earth? Zen teaches us that every action, from the way we breathe to the way we move, is an opportunity to heal, to be present. When we walk with awareness, we connect with the earth. With every step, We ground ourselves in the now. With every breath, we merge with the moment. Let me share with you the teachings of one Zen master, Shunryu Suzuki. He said, "When you are walking, walk with a feeling of just walking. When you are eating, eat with a feeling of just eating. When you are washing dishes, wash with a feeling of just washing dishes." In those simple everyday moments, we heal, we awaken, we come home to ourselves. It's not the grand gestures or the distant goals that heal us. It's the way we show up in the small, ordinary tasks. And this, my friends, is Zen in motion. It's not about escaping life to find peace. It's about bringing peace into the life you already have. Whether you're walking, working, or simply existing, the key is awareness. In fact, Zen masters say that when you become aware of every action, when you stop rushing, when you allow yourself to be with what is, you're walking the path of true healing. But let me ask you, when was the last time you truly walked, not with your mind on the past or worrying about the future, but just walking, feeling the ground beneath your feet, the rhythm of your breath, the sensation of your body in motion? Zen invites us to return to that simplicity, to bring awareness to every moment, to turn our lives into the path of healing. Because when we truly show up, when we walk with awareness, we become the very healing we seek. Now that we've explored walking with awareness, we're about to discover the final, most powerful healing secret. In the next chapter, we dive into the profound power of compassion and how it heals not only others, but ourselves as well. The healing power of compassion. There's a saying in Zen, compassion is the true nature of the mind. It's not something we learn. It's who we are at our core. In the journey of healing, we've learned to quiet the mind, to embrace emptiness, to be present in every step. But there's one more piece that completes the puzzle: compassion. Compassion is not just a feeling. It's not a fleeting emotion. It's an action, a choice, a way of being. But here's the catch. To truly give compassion, we must first receive it. How many times have you been hard on yourself? Judging, criticizing, believing you're not enough? Zen teaches us that true healing begins when we open our hearts to our own suffering, when we stop pretending to be perfect and embrace our flaws with love. This is the first step: self-compassion. Imagine holding yourself in the same kindness that you would offer a dear friend. Would you criticize them for their mistakes? Or would you offer them patience, understanding, and love? Now imagine offering that same kindness to yourself. When we forgive ourselves, we allow healing to happen. We make space for growth. We let go of guilt and shame and embrace the truth that we are already whole. But compassion doesn't stop there. When we open our hearts to ourselves, we naturally open them to others. Zen teaches that true compassion is boundless. It doesn't discriminate. It doesn't measure who deserves it and who does not. Imagine a world where every person practiced this kind of compassion, not just for others, but for themselves as well. This world would be healed, and so would we. Compassion heals the wounded. It binds the broken. It lifts the fallen. When you meet someone suffering, instead of trying to fix them, just be with them. Hold space for their pain. Offer a kind word, a gentle touch, an open heart. In those moments, you become the channel for healing. Not because you've done anything extraordinary, but because you've allowed the extraordinary to flow through you. In the end, Zen shows us that the ultimate act of healing is not about removing suffering, but transforming it. Not by running from pain, but by embracing it with open arms. Because when we heal ourselves, we heal the world. Now, as you reflect on these teachings, I invite you to ask yourself, how can you practice compassion today? Not just for others, but for yourself? Take a moment to breathe, to connect, and allow the healing power of compassion to flow through you. If this message resonated with you, if you feel inspired to bring more Zen into your life, I invite you to join our journey. Hit the like button, subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom, and share this video with someone who might need it. Together, we can create a more compassionate world, and as always, leave a comment below. How will you bring compassion into your life today? Thank you for joining me on this journey of healing, and may peace and love fill your heart always.